The night seemed ordinary at first. Most people in the small town were already getting ready to sleep. The shops had closed, the streets were empty, and the cool air carried the faint smell of grass and burnt wood from someone's evening cooking. Everyone expected the same ending to the day, quiet and slow, just like the town itself. Nothing ever really changed there. News traveled slowly, people moved slowly, and the days passed like pages from an old notebook that had been written many times before. But that night, the sky decided to break the routine. It began with a soft rumble, something too quiet to be a storm and too strong to ignore. Some people, half asleep, thought it was thunder. A few who were still awake opened their windows to check if rain was coming. The clouds looked normal at first. Then a strange streak of light cut across the sky, like someone had drawn a bright line with burning chalk. It wasn't like a shooting star that disappeared quickly. This one stayed glowing, leaving a trail that shimmered like crushed glass floating in the dark. Children ran out of their houses, pointing at the sky. Pets started acting strangely, barking, scratching the ground, whining. Some adults stared up in confusion. Others hurried inside, thinking something dangerous was happening. The local power lines flickered, bulbs dimming and then returning to life. People started talking loudly, calling neighbors, asking what they were seeing. Then came the impact. A burst of light exploded behind the hills, silent at first, then followed by a dull shaking sound that came a few seconds later. It was like lightning trapped inside the earth. The ground trembled under everyone's feet for just a moment, not enough to make things fall, but enough to shock anyone who felt it. And afterward, everything turned calm again, almost suspiciously calm, leaving a long patch of fading blue-green light in the sky. Some called the police. Others dialed the nearest radio station, and a few ran to the top of their rooftops to get a better look. But nobody really understood what they had just witnessed. People argued. Some said it was a meteorite. Others believed it was a crashed satellite. One or two whispered it might be something secret, like a military test that had gone wrong. A young researcher named Armin had come to visit his hometown the day before. He was studying astrobiology at a local university in the city, but rarely got a chance to come home. He wasn't a famous scientist, but he was passionate about small things that others ignored: tiny life forms, organisms that survived in harsh conditions, the chemistry behind things that could exist beyond Earth. While most of the town talked about crops, livestock, or family matters, he loved talking about how life might look on other planets. He had been sitting outside with a cup of tea, watching the night sky like he always did when he came back home. His mother often joked that he stared at stars more than he looked at people. Tonight, that quiet habit paid off. He had seen every detail, from the first glow to the final burst. His heart raced as he watched, not out of fear, but curiosity. He was the kind of person who saw questions before he saw danger. Within minutes, a small group formed near him. Some of his childhood friends, a neighbor from across the street, and a few older men who liked discussing everything as if they were experts. They asked him what he thought it was. He didn't want to rush, because he knew that guessing without proof meant nothing. Still, he admitted it was nothing normal. They kept talking until the light disappeared from the sky. But the town did not sleep after that. People stayed outside longer, whispering ideas and theories, as if the stars themselves were listening. It was the most excitement the town had experienced in years. The next morning, rumors were everywhere. A few fishermen claimed they saw the hills glowing at night. A farmer swore his cows refused to go near the northern fields. Children made stories about aliens landing nearby. Some adults laughed at them, but secretly wondered if the kids might be right. Armin woke up earlier than usual. The sky was clear, the sunlight bright enough to wipe away last night's mystery, but not from his mind. He had spent half the night thinking about the impact. His curiosity grew stronger every time he replayed the moment in his head. He knew that meteorites were rare, and the light he saw didn't look like anything ordinary. If it truly was a meteorite, there might be fragments. If it was something else, then the ground might show signs of it. The hills weren't far, just an hour's walk. He felt restless, like someone waiting for an answer to an important question. So he convinced a few people to go with him and see what had landed there. Some joined out of curiosity, others only because they had nothing else to do that morning. A few were simply afraid something dangerous might be out there, and they felt safer going as a group dot as they walked. The air felt cooler than usual. The ground near the hills seemed disturbed, as if the earth had been scraped. Birds avoided the area, flying in wide circles instead of passing over it. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked endlessly. When they reached the spot, they expected burnt metal, broken pieces of rock, or something that clearly looked like it didn't belong. Instead, there was a crater deep and wide enough to show something heavy had hit the ground. But there was no metal scrap, no rock fragments, no smoke, no smell of burning. Instead, the base of the crater was filled with something that looked like dust. Not gray dust like dirt, but shimmering, almost glowing powder that seemed to sparkle even without sunlight directly hitting it. No one knew what to say at first. The silence felt heavy, as if the dust itself was waiting for someone to make the first move. In curious excitement, people leaned closer. The dust glimmered, shifting slightly as if it had a life of its own. Someone brushed their fingers against it. The particles stuck lightly to his skin, shining like tiny crystals. The others followed, touching and picking up some of it with bare hands, fascinated by its softness and glow. Armin hesitated at first, his scientific mind telling him to be careful. But after seeing everyone else touch it, he picked up a small amount between his fingers. It felt cool, softer than sand, yet strangely clingy, almost as if it wanted to remain on his skin. He watched it for a few seconds longer than the others, thinking of microscopic organisms, unknown minerals, and possibilities that could change everything he had studied. He wasn't thinking about danger. No one was. They were too caught up in the discovery. Nobody brought gloves, masks, or tools. They were simple people who found something strange and reacted like normal human beings, curious, excited, innocent, and unaware. Some filled small bags with the dust to show others. A few joked about selling it. Someone said it might be worth more than gold. Another laughed and said the dust looked like magic. Armin felt something different. He didn't think of money or jokes. He felt a quiet sense of responsibility, like he had just touched something that shouldn't be ignored or mishandled. He decided to take a small sample to his homemade lab in the storage room behind his house. He didn't know what he would find, but he knew he had to look deeper. He had no way of knowing that the decision he made would change not only his life, but the lives of everyone who had touched that dust. No one imagined that something so soft and beautiful could bring anything harmful. No one expected that the price of their curiosity might not be paid that day, or even that week, but it would be paid slowly, quietly in ways none of them could see coming. After taking the small jar of dust to his home, Armin placed it carefully on the wooden table in his makeshift lab. The morning sunlight fell through the window, illuminating the tiny particles, making them sparkle like 1,000 little stars trapped in a bottle. For a moment, it looked beautiful, almost magical, but Armin knew better than to be distracted by appearances. He had studied unusual minerals, microorganisms, and other rare natural substances, and he understood that beauty often hid secrets that could be dangerous. He started with simple observations. He opened the jar just enough to peer inside. The dust seemed almost alive. It shifted slightly, like it was aware of him. When he waved his hand over the opening, tiny particles lifted, floated in the air, and then settled back down. He noted this carefully, jotting it down in a notebook with neat handwriting. His mind raced with possibilities. Could it be some unknown mineral? Could it carry microscopic organisms? Could it be something that had come from another part of the universe? He felt a thrill he had never felt before in his life. This wasn't just another experiment. This was the kind of discovery that changed everything. Armin decided to conduct small tests. He took a magnifying glass and examined the dust carefully. It wasn't like ordinary dirt or sand. The particles were almost perfectly spherical in some places and thread-like in others. They reflected light strangely, almost like they contained tiny layers of crystal or metal, but they weren't hard. They felt soft, almost like a fine powder of silk, but when he touched it with a metal tool, the threads seemed to move slightly, adjusting themselves as though they were aware of the intrusion. He recorded everything, his hand shaking slightly with excitement. This was unlike anything he had ever seen before. He tried exposing a small amount to warm air, just from his hand hovering over it. To his surprise, the particles responded. They seemed to gather together into tiny clumps, then slowly spread apart again. Armin leaned closer, his curiosity completely overtaking his caution. He knew he was risking something. Dust, after all, could carry bacteria, chemicals, or even radiation, but he couldn't resist the pull of discovery. Each movement of the particles felt deliberate, almost like they were interacting with him. He had never felt such a strange connection with a substance before. It wasn't alive in the way animals or plants were, but it wasn't entirely inanimate either. Word began to spread slowly in the town. People had noticed the light from the previous night still faintly glowing near the hills. Some had gone back to look, and now more rumors spread. One or two claimed that crops had grown oddly tall near the crater. A few said their animals acted strangely, moving faster than usual and then collapsing, though no one could explain why. Children whispered stories of small glowing creatures that came from the sky, while adults argued about whether it was a meteorite, a secret experiment, or even something supernatural. Armin listened to these stories with a mixture of amusement and concern. Curiosity was normal, but misinformation could be dangerous. He returned to the dust in his lab again, examining it under a small magnifying device he had borrowed from the university. The thread-like particles fascinated him most. Under higher magnification, they looked like tiny strands woven with invisible filaments. He had studied microbes before, but these were different. They didn't resemble anything he knew. He suspected there might be a biological component, something capable of growth. Yet he couldn't tell if they were harmful. That question made him pause. Unlike his previous research, he was now dealing with something completely unknown. And unknown could be dangerous. Still, Armin couldn't resist experimenting further. He placed a tiny sample on a piece of paper and set it near a small lamp. He watched as the dust responded to the heat. It shifted, expanded, and clumped together. It almost seemed intelligent. When he blew gently on it, it didn't scatter like normal dust. Instead, it seemed to move in the direction he blew, almost as if it had recognized the air movement and adjusted. He scribbled notes furiously, imagining that perhaps this was an entirely new form of life. Not alive like animals, but alive in a way he had never seen before. Meanwhile, the townspeople continued their lives, though the crater became a point of fascination. Children would wander nearby, careful to stay on the edges. Farmers avoided the area, worried that something might be wrong with the soil. Some of the people who had collected dust went about their daily chores with it stuck to their clothes, their fingers, and even their hair. No one noticed anything immediately harmful. At first, that only reinforced the belief that it was harmless, maybe even a blessing. However, small signs began to emerge. One of Armin's friends, who had picked up dust with bare hands, began feeling slightly dizzy and unusually tired. He shrugged it off, thinking it was just fatigue. Another person reported a mild rash on their hands. A farmer mentioned that one of his cows refused to eat and appeared restless. Everyone laughed nervously and said it must be coincidence, not connecting the minor symptoms to the dust they had touched. Armin, however, began feeling uneasy. His scientific instinct warned him that something unusual was happening, something subtle but significant. Armin spent hours observing, testing, and recording. He noticed that even the smallest contact with the dust left particles on his skin that refused to wash off completely. They clung lightly, almost like they were attracted to his warmth. He had never seen anything with that property. As the day progressed, he experimented with small water droplets, noting how the dust interacted with moisture. It was fascinating. The particles seemed to dissolve slightly, then reassemble. He felt as if the dust was teaching him a secret language, showing him its patterns and rhythms, but leaving the full meaning just out of reach. It was thrilling and terrifying at the same time. By the evening, a few townspeople had returned to Armin's home, bringing more dust samples they had collected. They wanted to see what he thought of it. Some were joking about selling it or keeping it as a souvenir. Others were more cautious, worried that it might be dangerous. Armin encouraged them to share what they knew, but also warned them not to touch it further. "We don't know what this is yet," he said carefully. "Even if it looks harmless, it could affect us in ways we can't see right now." Some nodded, taking his warning seriously, but others laughed it off, thinking he was overreacting. That night, after everyone left, Armin sat alone, staring at the jar. The particles glowed faintly in the dim light, reminding him of the first streak of light in the sky. He felt a deep mixture of wonder and responsibility. This wasn't just a discovery for a university paper. It was something alive, mysterious, and powerful. It had entered their town, their lives, their homes, and they had no idea what it could do next. He began to plan further experiments, trying to determine its composition, how it moved, and whether it was truly alive. He set up small containment areas with barriers made from jars, trays, and carefully labeled samples. He even considered reaching out to colleagues at the university, though he hesitated. Revealing something this strange without complete understanding could cause panic, especially if the dust reacted differently in larger quantities or in different environments. He decided to wait, to study quietly, and to learn as much as he could before involving anyone else. Sleep that night was restless. Armin kept dreaming of threads moving in the dark, reaching for him, forming patterns he couldn't decipher. He woke multiple times, checking the jar to make sure the dust had not moved while he was asleep. By morning, he felt both exhausted and exhilarated. He had never felt such a powerful pull toward discovery before. Something about the dust made him feel connected to it, almost like it was aware of his presence, almost like it was waiting for him to understand it. As the days passed, small changes began to show in the town. People who had handled the dust started feeling slightly weaker or tired than usual. A few mentioned small irritations on their skin. Animals behaved erratically, sometimes refusing to eat, other times restless or unusually active. No one made a direct connection yet, but Armin noticed patterns and became increasingly concerned. He realized that the dust might have biological properties, interacting subtly with living beings. If that were true, the entire town could be at risk, and the stakes were higher than anyone imagined. Despite his concerns, Armin could not stop studying it. Each day brought new discoveries. He found that the dust responded differently to heat, moisture, and even different types of light. It seemed intelligent in its reactions, almost playful, but there was something deeply serious underneath. He began wondering if the dust had a purpose, a natural instinct he could not yet understand. He thought about its journey from the sky, how it survived the impact, and what it might want from the world it had entered. By the end of the week, Armin had collected detailed notes, sketches, and observations. He knew that the moment of true discovery was coming, though he could not predict exactly what it would be. He also knew that the longer the dust remained in contact with humans and animals, the more likely they were to see consequences. He felt a weight of responsibility on his shoulders. This was no longer just about science or curiosity. It was about protecting people, about understanding something far beyond ordinary knowledge, something extraordinary that Days passed quietly after the initial discovery, but the quiet was deceiving. At first, it seemed like nothing had changed. The town returned to its routine. People went to work in the fields, tended their livestock, and ran errands like nothing unusual had happened. Children played near the edges of the hills where the dust had fallen, laughing and chasing each other, while parents kept a wary eye. But small, subtle signs began to appear, almost too slight for most to notice, yet impossible for Armin to ignore. He had been observing the dust continuously, and he began noticing changes in himself and in the people who had touched it. It started with little things. One of his friends, who had been helping him collect samples, mentioned feeling tired during the afternoon, even after a full night's sleep. Another said his hands felt itchy, almost like a mild allergic reaction, but shrugged it off. Armin remembered these people had handled the dust directly. His mind immediately made a connection. Could the particles be causing these effects? And if so, how serious could it become? He decided to conduct further experiments. Using a small microscope he had borrowed from the university, he placed a tiny amount of dust on a glass slide. Under the lens, he could see the particles forming strange patterns. They were not stationary. They seemed to move subtly, almost crawling across the slide. Thread-like strands stretched and intertwined, forming structures he could not explain. He tapped the slide lightly with a small tool to see if it would respond, and sure enough, the strands seemed to pull back slightly, then spread out again as if recovering. Armin felt a chill run down his spine. This was no ordinary dust. Something alive, or at least something that behaved in ways similar to life, was present. Meanwhile, symptoms among the townspeople became harder to ignore. The friend who had been constantly tired now complained of a dull headache and a slight fever. Another person began feeling restless at night, unable to sleep even though he was exhausted during the day. The local doctor, unfamiliar with anything like this, treated these cases as minor illnesses, stress, fatigue, or perhaps seasonal fever. Nobody suspected the dust. Not even the people who had been closest to it. Armin, however, could not ignore the signs. He had felt subtle changes himself. His skin itched in certain places. Faint red marks appeared and then faded within hours. He sometimes experienced a metallic taste in his mouth, especially after handling the dust. He felt lighter in some ways, almost like the energy in his body had shifted. He noted all of this in his journal. Each entry was more detailed than the last, and he included sketches of what he had seen under the microscope. He could not explain these changes logically, but he was sure they were connected to the dust. One morning, as the sun rose over the hills, he decided to check on the farm animals near the crater. A farmer had called, worried about one of his cows. When Armin arrived, he noticed the cow pacing restlessly, its movements jerky and unnatural. It refused to eat and seemed to be staring blankly at the horizon. Nearby, smaller animals, chickens, goats, even a few dogs, were behaving erratically. Some were unusually energetic, running in circles, while others lay motionless for long stretches. Armin's stomach sank. The dust had touched not only humans, but animals too. The problem was spreading. Back in his home lab, Armin tried to understand the effects more scientifically. He decided to expose a tiny drop of dust to different conditions: warmth, light, moisture, and even gentle air currents. The dust responded differently in each scenario. Warmth seemed to make it expand and move more aggressively, while light caused it to stretch toward the source. Moisture caused it to clump and then break apart, almost like it was reorganizing itself. He began to suspect that the dust could adapt to its surroundings, and worse, it might be interacting with biological matter in ways humans could not yet measure God. It was not long before more severe symptoms appeared in people who had handled the dust directly. One man complained of numbness in his fingers, followed by tingling sensations that made it difficult to hold tools. Another mentioned a strange warmth under the skin that moved in patterns he could not describe. A young woman started experiencing short, shallow breaths, as though her lungs were not fully cooperating. People began to whisper quietly to each other, afraid that something was wrong, but unsure what it could be. The town, which had once been peaceful, now carried a subtle tension that no one could explain. Armin observed all of this with growing concern. He tried to warn people not to touch the dust, but curiosity and disbelief were strong. Children continued to play near the crater. Adults handled it for experiments or jokes, and some even collected more to show their friends. Armin understood human nature. People are rarely careful with things they do not fully understand, especially when it appears harmless. And yet, he could not stop feeling responsible for the growing signs of danger. One afternoon, he noticed a change in his own body that worried him deeply. His veins seemed more prominent, slightly reddish under the skin, and he felt a faint vibration in his fingertips, almost like a faint electrical current. At first, he thought it was imagination, but the sensation persisted. When he held his hand near the dust, he noticed that the particles seemed to react to his touch, stretching toward his fingers before recoiling. Armin felt a mix of awe and fear. He was connected to the dust in ways he could not yet understand, and he realized the connection was growing stronger every day. He began keeping careful records of each person who had contact with the dust, noting their symptoms, behaviors, and any changes over time. He observed that the effects varied from person to person. Some experienced only mild fatigue or irritation, while others were already showing more serious signs. Unusual warmth under the skin, minor rashes, or constant dizziness. The pattern was clear. The longer a person stayed near or handled the dust, the more pronounced the symptoms became. As he worked, Armin's mind kept returning to the night the object had fallen from the sky. What had survived the impact? How had it remained so intact, and why did it behave this way? It was not just an object. It had properties, behavior, perhaps even a purpose he could not yet comprehend. And now it was interacting with humans, slowly, subtly, in ways that were almost undetectable at first, but could become dangerous over time. Armin became increasingly careful in his interactions with the dust. He wore gloves, used tools, and avoided direct contact, but the connection was not so easily broken. Tiny particles clung to his clothing and skin despite his precautions. He noticed that even being near the dust seemed to affect him. His heart rate would change slightly, his focus would sharpen or dull unpredictably, and the metallic taste in his mouth sometimes returned. He began to feel a strange bond with the dust, as though it recognized him as an observer, as though it responded to his presence with awareness. The town, meanwhile, continued unaware of the real danger. Parents warned children not to go too close to the crater, but curiosity won over caution. The animals continued behaving oddly. People joked nervously about the strange events, making up stories or attributing the changes to fatigue, weather, or imagination. The dust, quiet and almost patient, continued to work its influence slowly, imperceptibly, into everything it touched. Armin realized that the situation was becoming more serious than he had anticipated. What had seemed like a fascinating scientific opportunity was now a real threat. He tried to contact colleagues at the university, hoping for guidance, but found it difficult to explain the phenomena without hard proof. How could he describe something alive, moving, reacting, and possibly harmful without sounding ridiculous? He knew he had to be cautious. Revealing it too soon could cause panic, but waiting too long could allow the dust to spread further, causing more harm. One evening, as he reviewed his notes, he felt a faint movement under his fingertips. A tiny thread of dust, almost invisible, seemed to lift and coil toward him as if it had learned to sense his touch. He froze, watching carefully. The thread twitched and shifted slightly before retreating back into the jar. His heart pounded. It was becoming more than a chemical or mineral reaction. Something in the dust was aware, possibly intelligent in its own way. It responded not just to heat or light, but to him specifically. By now, more townspeople were experiencing symptoms. Dizziness, shortness of breath, mild fever, unusual rashes, tingling sensations, and restless nights became more common. People whispered about the dust, calling it magical or cursed. Few were willing to admit fear openly, but the unease was palpable. Armin felt a heavy responsibility pressing on him. He had to understand this substance before more people were affected. He spent the night thinking, planning, and observing. He realized the dust was not simply a curiosity. It was something new, something alive in a way humanity had not yet encountered. And he understood, with a growing sense of dread, that it was not content to remain inert. It was interacting, learning, and possibly integrating itself into those who had come into contact with it. Armin knew he had to prepare for what might come next. The subtle symptoms could become more serious. The patterns he observed in humans and animals were only the beginning. He could not predict how far the dust could go, or what it wanted. But he did know one thing: it was not harmless, and ignorance could come at a price. Days turned into weeks, and the small town that had once been quiet and predictable now felt subtly different, though no one could fully explain why. The crater remained, faintly glowing under the sunlight during the day and shimmering softly at night. People tried to go about their lives, but the invisible presence of the dust seemed to linger everywhere. Even those who had not touched it directly began noticing unusual sensations: sudden fatigue, restlessness, and a faint, lingering warmth under the skin. It was subtle at first, easy to ignore, but unmistakable to those paying close attention. Armin had been cautious, but he could no longer deny the changes in himself. The faint vibrations he had first felt in his fingertips grew stronger over time. His veins appeared more pronounced, slightly reddish, as if tiny currents were flowing beneath the surface. The metallic taste in his mouth returned more frequently, and at times, a subtle warmth pulsed through his chest and arms, almost like a heartbeat that wasn't entirely his own. At first, he had thought these sensations were stress or fatigue, but now he could not deny the connection to the dust. He tried to focus on his experiments, hoping that understanding the dust better would give him a way to reverse or control the changes. But the more he studied it, the more he realized he was part of the experiment in ways he could not fully understand. The threads of dust responded more aggressively to his presence. They seemed to move with intention, curling toward him even when he tried to avoid contact. Sometimes he would feel a faint tingling along his arms, as if the dust were connecting with him through the smallest particles clinging to his clothes or skin. His health began showing more noticeable signs. Fatigue became difficult to shake, even with long hours of sleep. Small red patterns appeared under his skin, sometimes forming intricate, almost geometric shapes that faded after a few hours. Sleep became restless. He often woke in the middle of the night, feeling as if something was moving beneath his skin. At times, he would touch his arms, hoping to reassure himself that it was only imagination, only to feel a subtle shift, a tiny pressure moving along his veins. At first, Armin tried to hide his symptoms from others. He didn't want to cause panic, and he wasn't sure how serious it was. But the changes could not be ignored. One afternoon, while checking a sample of dust under his microscope, he felt a sudden sharp warmth in his hands and arms. The dust on the slide seemed to react instantly, stretching and forming shapes he had never seen before. His heart raced, and a cold shiver ran through his body. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that the dust was not only observing him, but interacting with him directly. He was no longer just a scientist studying it. He had become a host, a vessel for something he did not yet understand. He began to notice small changes in his abilities and senses. His vision sometimes sharpened, seeing tiny movements in the air and faint glimmers that no one else could notice. Sounds felt louder, more distinct, and he could sense subtle shifts in the environment around him, almost as if the dust had heightened his awareness. At first, it felt useful, even exciting. He could detect details others missed, subtle patterns and movements in the dust and in the natural world around him. But there was also fear. He could not control when these abilities appeared. Sometimes they came unbidden, leaving him exhausted and disoriented. The town was beginning to feel the effects as well. People who had touched the dust directly continued showing strange symptoms: dizziness, mild fevers, restless sleep, rashes that appeared and vanished, and subtle changes in behavior. Some animals acted erratically, as if sensing the presence of something beyond the ordinary. A few people started avoiding the crater altogether, sensing that the dust was not simply inert. Still, most ignored the warning signs, believing it to be coincidence, natural illness, or imagination. Armin knew better. He understood that the dust was spreading subtly, interacting with humans and animals in ways that were impossible to measure with ordinary instruments. He became increasingly isolated in his home, spending long hours in his lab, observing, recording, and analyzing. He took extreme care to avoid direct contact with the dust, wearing gloves and protective clothing, yet he could not escape the subtle influence it had already established. Small particles clung to his clothes and skin, tiny invisible threads connecting him to the dust in ways he could neither see nor fully comprehend. One evening, as he worked under the dim light of a single lamp, he felt a sudden pulse through his body, a vibration that seemed synchronized with the movement of the dust under his microscope. The threads stretched, coiled, and then pulled back as if they were testing him, studying him. He could feel a faint pressure on his chest, like a heartbeat that was not his own. He realized then that he was no longer entirely himself. Something foreign had integrated into his body, moving through him, using him. He was aware, conscious, yet partially controlled by the subtle influence of the dust. The realization brought fear, but also clarity. Armin understood that the dust was not simply dangerous because of physical contact. It was dangerous because it could merge with life itself. It could adapt, integrate, and alter the beings it touched. The first symptoms, the fatigue, rashes, and subtle sensations, were only the beginning. Over time, the dust could embed itself deeper, affecting not only health, but perception, behavior, and identity. As he considered this, a knock on the door startled him. One of his friends, unaware of the changes he was experiencing, came to check on him. Armin quickly hid his hands and adjusted his shirt, trying to appear normal. They talked briefly about the dust, the strange patterns it formed, and the rumors spreading in town. His friend mentioned that another person who had touched the dust was complaining of strange sensations, but no one knew what to do. Armin felt a sense of urgency rising. The situation was growing more serious by the day, and he could no longer remain silent. The next morning, he decided to perform a more detailed experiment, one that could help him understand how deeply the dust had integrated with living tissue. Using small, controlled samples, he observed the way the particles interacted with tiny organisms he had kept in jars for study. The dust moved differently around living tissue, stretching and intertwining with microscopic structures in ways that suggested it was learning and adapting. Armin noted every reaction carefully, recording patterns, movement, and timing. It became clear that the dust was capable, influencing living systems in ways he had never imagined. By the end of the week, Armin's physical condition had changed noticeably. The subtle warmth under his skin was now persistent, spreading through his arms and chest. Small patterns, once faint, were now clearly visible beneath the surface. His senses were sharper, yet sometimes overwhelming, making it difficult to concentrate. He realized that the dust was no longer simply a foreign presence. It had begun to shape him from the inside out. He was becoming something more than human, and at the same time, he was losing parts of what had once been entirely himself. The town continued its quiet life on the surface, but beneath that calm, subtle tension was growing. People whispered about the crater, avoided certain areas, and noticed changes in themselves and their animals, but they could not explain why. Armin watched silently, feeling a heavy burden of responsibility. He knew that awareness alone was not enough. Action was required. Yet he also understood that the situation was delicate. Any sudden move could create panic or worse, make the problem worse. One night, unable to sleep, he sat by the window and stared at the faint glow of the crater. The dust shimmered in the darkness, calm and patient, as if it had been waiting for him all along. He touched his arm, feeling the strange currents beneath the skin, and understood fully that he was no longer simply a researcher or observer. He was a vessel. The dust had claimed a part of him, integrated itself into his being, and now influenced him in ways both subtle and profound. He felt fear, yes, but also a strange sense of connection. The threads of dust moved in response to his presence, almost as if recognizing him, responding to him. He realized that understanding the dust would require more than observation. It would require trust, patience, and a willingness to face unknown consequences. Yet the human part of him, the part that feared loss of control, remained. The balance between curiosity and caution was delicate, and every action now carried a weight he had never experienced before. Armin knew that the days ahead would not be simple. The dust was no longer something external. It was a living part of his environment, and increasingly, a part of himself. Every interaction, every experiment, every observation had to be handled with care. The town, unaware of the full danger, continued on, innocent and unsuspecting. And he, caught between his responsibility to the people and the strange influence growing within him, understood that the coming days would challenge everything he thought he knew about life, science, and human limits. As the days went on, the effects of the dust on the town and on Armin became impossible to ignore. What had started as faint, almost invisible signs now grew stronger, more noticeable, and more troubling. People who had touched the dust directly began showing persistent symptoms: fatigue, dizziness, unusual warmth under their skin, and strange rashes that appeared in intricate, fleeting patterns. Some animals acted erratically, refusing to eat or moving in ways that made no sense. The quiet town that had once felt safe and predictable now carried a tension that seemed invisible yet heavy. As if the air itself had changed. Armin could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him more than ever. Every day he observed subtle changes in himself. The dust had integrated more deeply, moving within him in ways that were beyond his control. His veins glowed faintly under his skin at times. The warmth in his chest and arms was stronger, and he sometimes felt a faint pulse traveling through him, separate from his heartbeat. He had become a vessel, and the threads of dust within him were alive, responding to his thoughts and actions, almost as if they could sense his emotions and intentions. Despite his fear, Armin continued to study the dust. He spent long hours in his lab, carefully noting every observation, every reaction. The particles responded differently, depending on conditions like heat, moisture, even the presence of living beings nearby. They seemed intelligent, capable of adapting to their environment, and able to interact with biological matter in ways he had never imagined. He realized the dust could influence both humans and animals, altering not just their physical state, but subtly affecting behavior, awareness, and even perception. As he studied, he saw patterns emerging. The dust seemed to spread slowly, almost invisibly, through contact. People who had handled it directly were affected first, but it also seemed to move through indirect means, dust that clung to clothes, animals that had wandered near the crater, and even small particles carried by the wind. The subtle signs, at first easy to ignore, were becoming harder to dismiss. Dizziness, rashes, fatigue, and restless nights were increasingly common. Armin understood that the danger was no longer localized. It had the potential to spread throughout the town, affecting more people with each passing day. He tried to warn others, but curiosity and disbelief were strong. Some people laughed at his warnings, others shrugged, believing the symptoms were due to fatigue, stress, or minor illnesses. Children continued to play near the crater, ignoring boundaries set by their parents. Farmers handled the dust carelessly, believing it to be harmless and shiny, perhaps even magical. The human tendency to dismiss the unknown frustrated Armin. But he understood it. He knew how easy it was to ignore danger when it seemed invisible, harmless, or even beautiful. Armin's own symptoms were worsening. He noticed that the dust was influencing him more than anyone else, likely because he had been in close contact with it for longer and had studied it more intensively. The warmth under his skin had become constant. His veins were more visible, with faint red patterns that sometimes formed complex shapes, fading and returning unpredictably. His senses were sharper in some ways. He could hear subtle movements, see faint glimmers in the air, and feel small currents, but these heightened senses came with exhaustion, making it difficult to focus or sleep. He sometimes felt as if the threads of dust inside him were reaching outward, interacting with the environment in ways he could not control. The town began to notice changes as well. Those who had handled the dust were no longer just fatigued. They were restless, agitated, or unusually quiet. Some people reported feeling their thoughts scattered, small flashes of unease or distraction they could not explain. Animals became more unpredictable. Even those who had not touched the dust directly seemed affected, as if the invisible threads had spread beyond the crater itself. The subtle changes in behavior, awareness, and physical condition were growing, and yet no one could fully understand what was happening. Armin realized that the dust was not just a physical substance. It was capable of interacting with living beings in a profound, almost conscious way. It could adapt, integrate, and influence biological systems. The first signs, the fatigue, rashes, and restlessness, were only the beginning. Over time, the effects could become stronger, more complex, and perhaps irreversible. He understood that the longer people remained exposed, the more the dust would integrate into their bodies, altering their health, behavior, and perception in ways that science had never seen before. He tried to contain the dust within his home, but it was difficult. Tiny particles clung to clothes, hair, and skin, spreading even with the utmost care. Every time he opened a sample or conducted an experiment, he risked further exposure. And yet, he could not stop. His curiosity, his sense of responsibility, and his desire to understand overpowered his fear. He knew that observing and recording the dust's behavior was the only way to prepare for what might come next. One morning, he noticed a change in his reflection that made him pause. The red patterns under his skin were more prominent than ever, forming lines that seemed to pulse faintly with his heartbeat. The warmth under his skin had grown stronger, moving along his arms, chest, and neck. He touched his face and felt a faint vibration, almost as if the threads of dust inside him were aware of his touch. He realized, with a mixture of awe and fear, that the dust was becoming an inseparable part of him, not just physically, but in ways that affected his perception and awareness. He began to document everything meticulously. Every symptom, every reaction, every observation was written down in great detail. He sketched the patterns he saw under his skin, the behavior of the dust under the microscope, and the subtle changes in people and animals who had been exposed. He understood that knowledge was his only weapon. Ignorance could be deadly. If he could predict how the dust behaved, he could protect himself and potentially others. The effects on the town grew more noticeable. People who had handled the dust were no longer able to ignore the subtle influence it had over them. Some became unusually quiet, withdrawn, and restless. Others displayed sudden bursts of energy, followed by extreme fatigue. Animals, too, behaved unpredictably, some refusing to eat or drink, while others moved erratically, pacing or running in circles. The patterns were inconsistent, but clearly related to proximity and exposure. Armin could see the danger spreading slowly, and he knew it was only a matter of time before it reached critical levels. The dust seemed to have an intelligence of its own. It moved, adapted, and responded to stimuli in ways that suggested awareness. When Armin handled samples, the threads shifted and coiled toward him. When animals or humans were nearby, the particles reacted subtly, almost as if observing and learning. He realized that the dust could influence living systems, integrating itself in ways that science had never measured before. It was alive, but alive in a way that did not follow any rules he knew. Armin's fear grew alongside his understanding. The dust was no longer just an anomaly. It was a force that could alter life itself. He knew that if it continued spreading, the town and potentially the world could be affected. Ignorance, once innocent, was now a threat. People's curiosity, their dismissals of danger, had allowed the dust to integrate more deeply into the environment, into living beings, and now into him. He understood the cost of that ignorance. One night, as he sat by the window staring at the faint glow of the crater, he reflected on the situation. The town continued its daily routines, unaware of the invisible threat. Children played, farmers worked, and animals wandered freely. Yet beneath the surface, subtle but significant changes were occurring. The dust was spreading, integrating, and influencing. And Armin, now partially a host, understood that he carried a responsibility that no one else could comprehend. He realized that knowledge alone would not be enough. Action was required, but it had to be measured, careful, and precise. Panic or rash decisions could make the situation worse. The dust was intelligent, patient, and adaptive. It would respond to fear, to carelessness, and to attempts to control it. The balance between curiosity, caution, and survival was delicate, and the consequences of missteps could be catastrophic. Armin spent the night observing the dust, noting every subtle movement, reaction, and interaction. He watched as the threads curled, stretched, and intertwined, seemingly aware of his presence. The patterns beneath his skin pulsed in response, connecting him to the environment in ways he could not fully understand. He realized that the coming days would test not only his knowledge, but his endurance, resilience, and ability to navigate a reality that had shifted in ways most people could never imagine. By morning, he made a decision. He would document everything in detail, creating a record of the dust's behavior, its effects on living beings, and his own experiences. This record would serve as a warning and a guide for anyone who might encounter it in the future. Knowledge, he realized, was the only way to protect humanity from a force that was already present, already integrated, and already powerful. Armin understood the price of ignorance was already being paid. People who had touched the dust, animals that had wandered too close, and even he himself were bearing the consequences. The subtle changes, once easily dismissed, were now impossible to ignore. TH. The days had become a rhythm of quiet tension, observation, and subtle fear. Armin had grown accustomed to the constant presence of the dust within him. It moved under his skin like a second pulse, responding to his thoughts, his touch, and the environment around him. Sleep was now a fragile thing, interrupted by dreams of threads weaving through air and skin, dreams in which he could feel the dust moving almost intentionally, as if trying to communicate. He could not tell if these dreams were warnings, insights, or just the effect of the particles merging with his nervous system. The town was slowly changing too. People no longer joked about the dust or dismissed it lightly. Even those who had once laughed nervously about it began to sense its presence. Fatigue, mild fevers, restless sleep, and tingling sensations had become more common. Animals moved erratically, and some refused to eat or drink entirely. Though no one openly panicked, an unease hovered over everyone, subtle but unmistakable. People whispered in hushed tones about the crater and the strange events surrounding it. Even the children had begun to notice. Asking questions that parents could not answer got Armin spent hours every day studying the dust. He observed how it moved, how it interacted with living tissue, and how it reacted to the environment. The threads inside him pulsed in harmony with the particles outside, and he realized that the dust was aware of him in a way that went beyond observation. It reacted to his presence, to his emotions, and to his thoughts. He had become both its host and its observer, caught in a delicate balance where understanding was inseparable from risk. His body had changed in subtle but undeniable ways. Faint warmth under his skin now pulsed rhythmically, like a secondary heartbeat. The red patterns beneath his veins sometimes formed fleeting, intricate designs that shimmered under certain lights. His senses had sharpened. He could hear subtle movements, detect faint changes in temperature, and even sense small air currents that escaped normal perception. At times, it felt like a gift, giving him awareness beyond ordinary human capability, but it also came with exhaustion and fear. Every enhancement was paired with vulnerability, a constant reminder that the dust had integrated itself deeply. Armin realized that understanding the dust fully required careful study, but also restraint. Any attempt to force the particles, manipulate them recklessly, or spread them further could have catastrophic results. He was intimately aware of the danger it posed, not only to himself, but to the entire town. He had witnessed how it had affected humans and animals alike, and he knew that the subtle integration was only the beginning. Over time, the dust could alter health, behavior, and perception in ways beyond immediate comprehension. The crater itself had taken on a new, eerie presence. At night, it glimmered faintly, illuminating the surrounding hills in a soft, otherworldly light. Armin noticed that even without direct contact, particles from the crater seemed to drift in the air, invisible but detectable by the subtle sensations they left on the skin. The wind carried them silently, reaching far beyond the original impact site. He worried that the dust was slowly expanding, integrating with the environment itself, and that the town was becoming an unintentional host. Despite the growing threat, the people of the town carried on as best they could. Farmers tended their fields, children played cautiously, and life continued, tinged with quiet unease. Some began avoiding the crater entirely, sensing a danger they could not name. Others, driven by curiosity or disbelief, ventured closer. Armin tried to warn them, sharing only what he could safely explain, careful not to cause panic. But he knew that understanding the true nature of the dust required patience, careful observation, and above all, acceptance of the unknown. One afternoon, Armin noticed a subtle shift in the behavior of the dust. The threads seemed to stretch outward slightly, as if exploring their surroundings more actively. When he moved near a jar containing dust samples, the particles responded almost like living beings, curling toward him and then recoiling. It was a reminder that the dust was not passive. It was intelligent in a way humans could barely comprehend. He realized that the particles were not only interacting with him, but learning from him, adapting to his presence, and perhaps preparing for actions he could not predict. Armin's own body reflected this growing integration. He experienced moments of heightened awareness, seeing details too fine for the naked eye, hearing distant sounds with unusual clarity, and sensing faint shifts in the environment. But alongside these gifts came vulnerability. His exhaustion was deeper, his focus more fragile, and the faint patterns under his skin more pronounced. It was clear that the dust was slowly taking control, guiding certain functions and responding to his nervous system in ways he could not fully manage. The realization brought fear, but also a strange clarity. He understood that resistance was impossible. Only careful navigation could maintain a balance. The town's animals had begun showing signs of unusual behavior as well. Some remained unusually alert, pacing restlessly, while others became lethargic or refused to eat. Birds that had flown over the crater circled repeatedly before leaving, and pets showed heightened awareness of subtle changes in their environment. Armin noted these patterns carefully. He understood that the dust was capable of affecting all living things, not just humans. Its reach extended beyond direct contact, integrating with the natural world and creating subtle but profound effects. Armin spent long hours documenting these changes. Every observation, every reaction, every pattern was recorded meticulously. He sketched the designs forming under the skin, the movement of dust threads, and the behaviors of animals in the area. Each page of his journal became a record of warning, a detailed account of a phenomenon that humanity had never encountered before. He understood that this knowledge was vital. Ignorance, once innocent, had become a danger, and he was determined to ensure that future generations could understand what had happened. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, he observed a faint glow from the crater. The dust shimmered in the fading light, particles moving with a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. He felt a pulse under his skin in response, a subtle vibration that made him aware of the intimate connection between himself and the dust. It was both beautiful and terrifying. He realized that the particles were no longer just observers or passive entities. They were active, aware, and deeply integrated with the environment and with him. The realization brought a new understanding. The dust had fallen quietly from the sky, but it carried properties far beyond ordinary matter. It could integrate with life, adapt, and subtly alter physiology, perception, and behavior. It was not inherently hostile, yet ignorance, carelessness, or misuse could turn it into a threat. Armin understood that the only way to coexist with this substance was through knowledge, caution, and respect. The stakes were high. A single mistake could allow it to spread further, integrating with more humans, animals, and the environment. Armin also understood that his own life had changed irrevocably. The dust was now part of him, influencing his senses, reactions, and awareness. He felt a strange connection to the threads within him, almost as if they were extensions of his own consciousness, yet with their own awareness and purpose. Sleep, focus, and even thought required careful balance. He knew that while he had gained insight and perception beyond ordinary human capability, it came at a cost. He was both empowered and vulnerable, and the balance was delicate. As the night deepened, he looked out over the quiet town. Lights flickered in houses, children slept, and the world seemed calm. Yet he knew that beneath the surface, subtle changes were spreading. Fatigue, restless sleep, faint warmth, and altered behavior were present in people and animals alike. The dust was integrating quietly, invisibly, but unmistakably. Ignorance had its price, and it was being paid slowly, silently. In Stardust and in the subtle changes of life itself, Armin returned to his lab, examining the dust one last time before bed. The particles shimmered faintly in the dim light, curling, stretching, and retreating in a rhythm he could almost understand. He realized that the story of the dust was far from over. It had become part of the world, part of him, and part of the town. Humanity had encountered something extraordinary, something beyond immediate understanding, and the consequences would unfold slowly over time. He wrote in his journal, detailing everything: the initial fall, the first observations, the subtle symptoms, the integration with humans and animals, and finally, the realization that he himself had become a host. The record would serve as a warning, a guide, and a testament to what had happened. Knowledge, he realized, was the only safeguard against the unknown. Ignorance had cost them exposure and subtle harm. Understanding might yet offer protection. As dawn approached, he placed the journal carefully in a safe spot and stared once more at the faintly glowing crater. He knew that the dust, intelligent and patient, would continue to influence the world around it, integrating with life and shaping its environment in ways humans could barely perceive. The story was not one of violence or chaos, but of subtle, pervasive change. The price of curiosity, the cost of ignoring the unknown, and the gift and burden of knowledge were intertwined. Armin understood that life, observation, and responsibility were inseparable.